Right, well, yeah, thanks everyone for joining tonight's Python in London. As you'll all know, that there is a waiting list, waiting room on even, so I'll let people in as and when they come in if you've got anyone coming late. And as always, this is being recorded, so keep an eye out for the recording and feel free to share it with anyone who may be interested in the future. But yeah, on to tonight's talk, joined by Ryan Howard tonight, talking specifically about Playwright and how it relates to writing UI tests in Python, its differences and maybe similarities for Selenium WebDriver and everything around that as well. So yeah, I'll hand over to Ryan now. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to shout them out or stick them in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that. But yeah, for now, over to you, Ryan.
Oh, yeah, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, it's kind of nice to be here actually, because I'm a software tester, so I do a number of talks for software testing meetups, and I enjoy working with Python. So it's quite nice to do something which mixes those two. Do a talk which mixes those two things. So it's yeah, thank you for having me. So
no worries, thanks for coming.
So today I am going to talk about Playwright, and specifically how you can write end-to-end web test automation using Playwright. So Playwright's quite an interesting one. Why I think it's worth shouting out is that actually in the Python world, there aren't an abundance of options when we look at automating web tests. If we compare to something like JavaScript, where you've got tools like Cypress and Protractor and Puppeteer and obviously Selenium WebDriver as well, you're kind of spoiled for choice in a way. And I understand why, because JavaScript is essentially the language of the web. But lots of people are using Python, and lots of people are building web apps in Python. But traditionally we've been stuck with kind of Selenium WebDriver. There are some open source projects which kind of sit on top of Selenium WebDriver, but for Playwright to enter the arena is kind of a nice change. And I'm not going to suggest it's any better or any worse than Selenium WebDriver, but it's just nice to have a different option. So before I go into details, a little bit more about me. As I said, I'm Ryan. I am a software tester and have been for about 10 years now. I live in Norwich, and that is where I started a test consultancy, LQA. So I like coffee and I like cricket, but specifically watching, not playing, because I would be terrible at playing. And I also like cognac, so I'll probably have a cognac after this, or maybe a bit later. And really, I dislike not having coffee. But that's kind of it for me. So let's have a look at Playwright a bit more. So I've got a few slides that I'm going to go through, and then I might, if we get time, just run a couple of those tests through, so we can see them working. The kind of test automation doesn't always lend itself to kind of live demos, because it often happens quite quickly and there's not much to show, but we'll see how we go. So what is Playwright? So this is taken directly from the Playwright documentation, and it goes something like this. Playwright is a Python library to automate Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit with a single API. Playwright is built to enable cross-browser web automation that is evergreen, capable, reliable, and fast. So We can break that down a bit and really understand what that kind of means and what Playwright is. So ultimately, Playwright is a Python package. You can pip install it. And what it does is it gives you a toolkit of functionality that you can then use to automate your web browsers. So typical things that you might expect if you've used Selenium would be things like being able to navigate to a web page, being able to interact with that page. So entering text into fields, clicking buttons, you know, that sort of thing. Just standard actions that a user might undertake when they go to a web application. So where we already have some of that functionality available with Selenium WebDriver, Playwright approaches it as a slightly different way. Because it's essentially brand new, they've really focused on providing the functionality that you might need testing what I'd refer to as a modern web application. So something built in, you know, React or Vue or something like that. Maybe even Django or Flask. So websites have changed quite considerably over the last decade. So we now get a lot more kind of single page applications. There's a lot more happening behind the scenes, a lot more HTTP requests behind the scenes, API requests, and so on. And Playwright's tried to tap into that and provide some functionality to kind of help test those types of applications, as opposed to a more kind of traditional website that we might have seen kind of 10 years ago. Conversely, Selenium's been around a long time, but it hasn't changed a lot in the last decade. We're on the brinks of a new Selenium 4, which I think will mean Selenium WebDriver kind of catches up some of the newer tools in the market. But as I say, Playwright's starting from scratch. So Playwright focuses on end-to-end testing. That's that ethos. So I thought before I get into actually how Playwright works, I'll just take this moment just to describe what I mean by end-to-end testing. And in this instance, I've taken a quote from an article on Customer Studio, but I think it sums it up quite well. So end-to-end testing is a technique that tests the entire software product from beginning to end to ensure the application flow behaves as expected. So basically, what we mean by end-to-end testing is a test which unlike a unit test might focus on a single function, single API call, that sort of thing. End-to-end tests are tests which kind of link those bits together to test a piece of functionality as a whole. So it might be registering for an application, registering on an application, for example, or logging in, or adding a product to a shopping basket, that sort of thing. And these tests tend to be a bit more complicated. There's lots more moving parts. You're reliant on the application performance. So they tend to be a bit more flaky, prone to breaking, and certainly slower. So these are things that Playwright has tried to address. So as a bit of an overview, so Playwright actually started as a fork of Puppeteer, which you may be aware of. It's a Node.js library, again for web automation testing. So actually some of the API calls, some of the syntax is very, very similar. It's developed by a team at Microsoft. So it's got some pretty heavy backing. It's open source. So it's currently got almost 4.5K stars on GitHub for the Python repo only. It's also a Node.js library. That's how it started, which has got 23 free, 24,000 stars. So it's growing in popularity. As I mentioned, it started as a node library, but now it has language bindings for Java, obviously Python, as we'll discuss, and C# as well. And there's also some unofficial bindings for Go as well. To show how new it is, the first 1.0, which is actually 1.8 version, was released in January this year. So it's only gone to a 1.0 version earlier, within the last 5 months. So it's pretty new. The node library is slightly further ahead. I think that went sometime last year to 1.0, but it's pretty new. So here is a typical Playwright test. So in this instance, I'm actually using PyTest, but everything under the test register user is my Playwright test. So I just wanted to call out a couple of pieces, a couple of lines here that are of interest. So you notice at the start, we have to create a browser. So in this instance, we're using the WebKit, which I'll mention a bit more in a minute, as our browser, and we launch that. And then once we've launched a browser, we can launch pages off of that browser instance. And it's using that page instance that we can then navigate to a web application using our page.goto, and then interact with that application. So you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 page.fill lines. So there we're doing things like entering details in particular fields. So the syntax is you provide an element, a locator. So in this instance, I'm using an XPath, and then a comma followed by the value that you want to input. So for example, in the first page.fill, I'm essentially inputting the text, the string Ryan, into the username field, and so on. This kind of tidies the text up compared to something like Selenium, where it's a little bit more wordy to get into a position where you're able to input text. Similarly with things like page.click, as you can imagine, that's just a mechanism for being able to click buttons. This is just a very small subset of the actions that you can take. But this is a really basic test. You can see at the end there, we've got the page.screenshot. It's just a mechanism for being able to take screenshots throughout your tests. You can see here that at the start, I'm actually importing sync_playwright from the sync API. Now, Playwright actually supports async IO as well. So if you did want to write tests using async IO, then you're able to do that using the Python language bindings for Playwright. Syntactically, you're still using the same page actions, but you're obviously wrapping that in a async function, async and await. I think this is probably because it's come from Node.js, which is asynchronous. So to keep things in line with that, you do have the ability to write tests asynchronously. So I just wanted to run through a couple of the features. So Playwright is cross-browser, and it describes itself as cross-browser. And that's regardless of the OS you're using. So actually, as part of the install of Playwright, it actually downloads the WebKit, Firefox, and Chromium drivers for you, installs them locally. And what that means is that regardless of what OS you're on, regardless of what browsers you have already installed on your machine, you're able to run tests directly on the WebKit driver, which is used by Safari, Firefox driver, and the Chromium driver, which is used by Google Chrome and the newer versions of Microsoft Edge. So it's not completely cross-browser though. It doesn't support things like IE, and obviously IE is still relatively commonly used, especially in maybe bigger corporations where changing your browser is not always straightforward if it's managed by a group policy or something like that. So there's no support for that. And secondly, we are talking about using drivers, not browsers here. So using the Chromium driver is not necessarily the same as using Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge. So they do also support the ability to specify Google Chrome. So you could run, instead of running on Chromium driver, you could run directly on the latest version, the latest stable version of Google Chrome, and the same with Microsoft Edge as well. But by default, it runs on the browser engines. Playwright has support for multi-page tabs and iframes out of the box. So this is crucial for end-to-end testing because often if you're testing an end-to-end flow, that might go off. It might launch additional pages of an application. Certainly, there could well be things hidden in iframe that you need to interact with or open up additional tabs to test an end-to-end flow. So Playwright makes this relatively simple through the use of context, which I've displayed down here. And the idea of a context is it's essentially like an incognito instance of the browser. So what actually takes a lot of time when you're creating your UI test is launching the browser. But in this instance, you only have to launch your browser once. And then you can create and destroy these contexts relatively quickly. So you can have multiple contexts in the same test. And off of those contexts, you can generate pages. So the pages, as we mentioned earlier, is where you'd interact with a web application. So you could have a context 1 here, might have 1 page. Context 2 here might actually have 2 additional pages. And then you can switch between them as you're testing. This is useful if you're doing an interesting use case I came across was that someone had an application where if you had opened up a record, someone else shouldn't be able to edit that same record. So you can utilize context to do something like that. Log in one context as a user, open up a file, a form, log in as a separate user on a different context and try and access that form. And then you can validate whether you're able to access it. So it's really useful for things like that. Playwright also auto waits for elements. So one of the challenges with UI automation has always been sometimes tests are faster than the web application. So you try and interact with a button which hasn't loaded yet, or find a field which is not visible, and that sort of thing, and your test breaks. So what we've had to do traditionally is find ways of sort of minimizing that risk, adding weights into our tests and that sort of thing. So Playwright, on the other hand, has a checklist that it runs through for different element types. So it will do things like check if an element it has stopped loading, check if any animation has been completed, check if that element is visible. And if it's not visible, it won't try and interact with that element. So again, we don't have to worry about adding our own weight. We can rely on Playwright to kind of manage that for us. We can set the timeouts on those things, so it's configurable, but it's nice that it's there as a standard. We also have auto element detection, and this is really useful for when we're using locators to find particular fields. So you can see I've got these two examples here, and they do exactly the same thing, but Playwright's clever enough to know that if your element locator starts with a double slash, then it's probably an XPath. And therefore, like in the second example, we don't need to actually pass in that we're using an XPath. It does this with other things as well, like CSS selectors. It tries to recognize what type of selector you're using, and then we'll use that. If you do need to specify, as I say, you can. So you can say that it's XPath or that you're using ID or something like that, if you need to. You can also chain elements together. So where you might have a tree in your DOM that you need to go down, you can chain these elements together. So you can have an XPath followed by a CSS selector until you find the element you need. It also works in shadow DOM as well. So again, a mechanism which is, I guess, more popular in sort of modern web applications. The ability to be able to pierce those shadow DOMs and find elements inside them is quite useful. So perhaps if I get time, I'll show you this shortly. But Playwright also exposes a code generation tool that we can use, and that allows us to via the terminal generate Playwright code as we click through an application. So it will record our actions and generate Playwright code off the back of that, which you can then essentially paste into your IDE and run. So I will hopefully get time to show you that shortly. Intercept network traffic. So this is a really cool feature, and it's not the only tool to do this. There are tools like Cypress which will do the same thing. And what this essentially allows us to do is intercept and check and monitor any of the sort of network traffic that's happening behind the scenes. So that might be fetching images, that might be calling APIs, that sort of thing. So we can monitor all that traffic and we can log, in this instance here, this page.on method is basically going to, for a particular page, log and print any network traffic that's happening. Where this becomes really useful is things like if you want to mock backend responses. So if you want to see how a web application handles a 500 response coming back from an API, then we can intercept a successful response coming back, update the header, and see how the web application handles that type of error. It's also really useful to speed up tests. So we can do things like we can stop any request with a .png. We can block them from responding to the web application. So we don't have to wait for a web page to load all the images on. We can just stop them, or we could mock a response back. If a response comes back with a list, which is relatively slow, we've got lots of things in there, we could mock it out to return just the first item, for example, if that's all we're interested in. So it just gives us the ability to speed up tests by choosing what displays on the page and how it displays. I realize I put these screenshots in, but didn't change the way they're loading, so sorry about that. So a couple more features. File upload and download, again, giving the user ability, being able to imitate a user uploading a file or downloading a bank statement or something like that. Again, these are features which are available out of the box, which other tools don't provide. So again, it just makes it very simple to run those end-to-end scenarios. Mobile device emulation. So Playwright, you can't run Playwright tests on mobile apps, specifically for web apps. But what you can do is you can run those web applications, but emulate mobile screen sizes and resolutions. So if you want to see what your web page looks like on an iPhone, you can do that using mobile emulation. You can also do things like change the geolocation. So if you want to test specific things about location or time zones, you can do this all within your context. So you could have one context which has got one geolocation, another context which has got another geolocation in the same test. And they're all independent of each other. Just a few more, just to final ones. So Playwright runs headlessly by default. So you can make it visible, but by default it's headless, which again is a performance. It's for performance purposes. As I mentioned previously, it does support async I/O. If you're using async I/O code anyway, then maybe it makes sense to kind of reuse it here. And I'm not going to show it here, but there is a PyTest plugin. So what I'll show you today, or what I've shown you so far, is vanilla Playwright, as it were. Sometimes using Playwright as the runner, but there sometimes using PyTest as the runner. But there is actually a PyTest plugin with some specific Playwright fixtures. So if there are specific scenarios that you want to run, or you're using PyTest anyway, it just simplifies the mechanism for launching your tests and making use of kind of other PyTest fixtures. So so that's some of the core features of PyTest of Playwright. Let's have a quick look at the limitations. So there's no direct API support. So you can't call an API using Playwright. You have to couple with something like requests. As I say, it's not, no out of the box support for that. As I mentioned earlier, you can't run Playwright on mobile apps, although I think there is a feature request to get it added at some stage in the future. It doesn't support all browsers, as I mentioned earlier. You can't run on IE, you can't run on Opera, and it is by default using the drivers rather than the actual browsers themselves. And as I mentioned, compared to things like Selenium, it is the new kid on the block. The documentation is pretty good, but what you do lose out on is the many and varied blog posts and Stack Overflow questions and stuff like that you'd get with something like Selenium WebDriver. As I mentioned, the documentation is pretty good, but you are limited in some respects. And finally, there is a lack of support for cross-browser tools like Browser Stack and Source Labs. So if you've used these tools before, it allows you to kind of run your tests on a kind of a grid, which allows you to utilize lots of different browser versions and instances. But there is, again, because it's such a new tool, there is a sort of a limited amount of support for that currently. But I'd expect a bit more in the future. So I just want to take the opportunity to show you a test. So as I mentioned earlier, we can do things like use Cogeneration to generate tests. If I launch this, that's actually going to launch. You can't see, but okay, that's going to launch the browser, but it's also launched this Playwright instance here, and you can see that it's already created a first step for me, or the steps needed to launch my browser. So creating the browser instance, creating a context instance, and creating a page off of that context. It's also navigated to my application, and it's got my final steps here to close those contexts and browsers. Now, as I interact with the application, so if I click in here, you can see that it starts to add some steps. I type Python and click search. You can see that it's recording the steps as I go, and a feature that I quite like is this here, where I can actually decide how I want that to look. So these are the Java, if I wanted Java or async Python, for example. So we'll stick to Python as it was. And what I can do is I can actually take this test, copy it, and then I can paste it. In here, and I've actually got a runnable test that I can. So hopefully this should run now. I'm just launching the browser on my other screen, so it's not very useful. But so if I do. See if I can move it over. Don't think I can very well, but if I, but basically what that's doing is that's running on my other screen. Let's do this way, it might be a bit easier. Okay, so you can see that it's running. I haven't got any assertions or anything in here, so it's not really testing anything. But you can see it's created our test and run it. So it also tries to add some assertions here. So it's checked what the endpoint is at this point. So it tries to add some assertions that we could use if we wanted. But yeah, as I mentioned, Playwright runs headlessly by default, so we can pass in things like this headless equals false to make it visible to us. Similarly, I'm using slow-mo here to slow down the test slightly. Otherwise, you can't. Otherwise, you can't really see very much. Quite quickly. So if I just go back to my. Are there any questions?
Seems like everyone's happy. Yep.
Do you know what? I didn't know how I was doing for time. I can just show you. This is the example of a test. The test that I displayed in the slides. So this is exactly the same thing here, but we're actually using PyTest to run this one, so I can. Show you. Still got this open. Close this down. That stops my cogeneration. But now, if I run my PyTest instance, it's going to pick up my test. This is just going to go to a registration form.
A couple of comments in the chat as well from Ivan. Are you running Playwright in production now?
So I haven't yet. So I've just started using it on a project that I'm working on. So that will go, eventually it'll be running in production, yeah.
And Malcolm asks, what IDE are you running?
So this is PyCharm. But obviously you can run VS Code if you want to, or whatever whichever other IDE you want to run. So I was playing with the tests a minute ago, so I think I broke them. So my login test is broken, but my my register test has worked. So I just wanted to mention that so when your test runs, you can add, as I mentioned earlier, you can add these screenshots. So you can capture screenshots as you go along, and you can even set it up to record your sessions as well. And it will generate a video for you of your sort of tests at the end.
Okay, great. A question from Ferran. Can you auto screenshot in case of a failure too?
Yeah, you can. You could screenshot in. You could capture an error and screenshot it. I don't think it's in the same mechanism as some tools, as you can sort of specify screenshot on failure. You still have to capture the error, I think, and screenshot it as part of the sort of error capturing.
And Cecil asks, can the test suites be integrated into the CI/CD pipeline?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I should mention, yeah. So there is there's a GitHub action which is already available. There is a Docker image already available as well, so you can run these tests in Docker. You've got a GitHub action there if you're running your CI/CD through directly through GitHub. But you can also integrate it with Circle CI or Travis or Jenkins. And actually, the document where the documentation is pretty good is on those integrations. So there's a CLI you can use to, so for example, GitHub Actions, Docker, Azure, and so on. So there's the documentation is there, and there's you can hook it up to most, if not all, of the sort of more commonly used CI/CD build platforms.
A couple more as well. Mikhail's asked, you said Playwright uses the drivers, not the actual browsers. Does Selenium do something different? And on that as well, Ivan's asked, with Selenium, oh, sorry, Ivan's responded actually, sorry. I was reading his answer out as if it was a question. But he's also asking about, does Playwright offer the same features about extracting tests as Selenium does?
Extracting tests?
I think it's texts.
Oh, text, sorry, yes.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, you absolutely can. So there's a whole bunch of, I've shown you very few, but yeah, it's very easy to grab text from a particular field as well. So whether it's, you know, placeholder text, or you know, an alert or something, or a pop-up which appears, you want to validate that the warning message that appears or something like that is what you'd expect, and it's quite easy to extract that text. You do it much the same way, so you locate that element and you just read the text out, and then you can assert that based on what you expect to see.
And going back quickly to Mikhail's question, he said, you said Playwright uses the drivers, not the actual browsers. Does Selenium do something different?
Selenium does much the same, actually. It uses the drivers, but what you do have with Selenium is a bit more control over what drivers that you use. So what you gain with Selenium is control over those drivers. What you lose is sort of the autonomous, as I call it, nature of Playwright. So Playwright will download the drivers, and then you can use them. Whereas with Selenium, you have to download those yourself, install them yourself, and add them to the path and reference them in your project. I think there are some packages, Python packages, which will kind of manage it for you. But you are, if you want to do that, then you're installing more packages on top of that.
Great, and a follow-up from Ivan as well, going back to the previous question. Says he normally uses or sometimes uses Selenium to web scrape. Is he able to do the same with Playwright?
The honest answer is I don't know. I'm not sure. I can find out. But, I think it might be possible, but I have to look into it. I'm not sure.
Any other questions at the moment? Looks like everyone's happy. Yeah, well, obviously, thanks for a great talk, Ryan, and some great questions, which is always good. Shows everyone's paying attention at least. But yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks everyone for joining this evening. You know, please keep an eye on the meetup group. This recording will be going out. Recorded from the start. I know a few people are a little bit late, so keep an eye on that. And then obviously you can follow the presentation through in your own time as well. If you'd like to check out the other groups we run as well here at Oliver Bernard. So I also run the Golang in London group, but we've got various of other ones around other technologies. There's a QA in London one actually that Ryan's speaking at again in a couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for that. So just have a look on the Oliver Bernard website. But yeah, again, thanks a lot, Ryan. Thanks everyone for coming, and keep an eye out for the recording.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Cheers, guys. Bye.